What do you know about love? Probably a lot. Everyone has his own story, his own experience. Some remember the first touch, others the last goodbye. Some call it light, others call it pain. But there's a love that doesn't ask for a choice. It demands sacrifice. You've heard the tragedies, many tragedies, but you've never heard mine. Now I'm going to tell you how one woman loved two men, and what a lesson fate taught her. That morning, when the first rays of sunlight hit the veranda, I was already on my feet. The house woke slowly, as it always did. Pink light drifted down the shutters, slid down the windowsills, blurred across the floor, so predictable, as if to remind me that a new day is not always a new life. I poured my coffee into the same fine china cup, too fragile to really use, but suitable for the morning silence. Sitting up straight, as she'd been taught as a child, the white robe touched my skin, almost weightlessly, and the breeze from the window rippled the curtain as if trying to reach something inside me. Everything was just as it should be. Too right, too quiet. I lived in a house that many people dreamed of. I was the wife of a man respected by the whole neighborhood. I had everything a woman needs to be happy, everything except him. I was called Mrs. Whitmore with reverence, sometimes with envy, sometimes with veiled fear. Elias was a man of the law, a prosecutor, the voice of justice, a living example of how persistence and a cool mind pave the way to power. He'd been my husband for 15 years, and I still loved him. But there was no more fire or air in that love, only stone. We were a good couple on the outside, and a bad couple in private. I didn't dream of another life. I just stopped feeling this one. And somewhere out there beyond the dusty road, in the desert and dusk, something was already approaching. Something that would break down the doors of my world, and I wouldn't even hear it come in. That afternoon I went to the city. I didn't have any particular reason, just wanted to see the people, the streets, the shop windows. Sometimes I left the ring on the dressing table and wore a simple dress. Not the kind of dress I wore to dinner parties. A dress in which I could not be recognized at first sight. I liked to be in the shadows, unnoticed, without name, without position, without rules. I walked among the people, listening to the arguments at the butcher's shop, the slamming of the saloon doors, the creaking of the grain cart. I wasn't looking for anything, but something seemed to be looking for me. I didn't notice him right away. It was just that at some point the conversations around me became quieter. It was as if the air itself had become tighter, tauter. The men on the porch stopped laughing. Someone looked away. A woman cradled her baby. I turned around. He was walking down the street as if he knew every speck of dust under his boots. Tall, unshaven, in a worn jacket and wide-brimmed hat, with a slight smile on his face, like someone who keeps someone else's secret in his pocket. He didn't look at people, he read them. And no one knew what to make of that look. I stood aside by the window. He passed by without looking at me, but for some reason I felt as if his shadow was still in me. Like someone had opened a window in a stuffy room, like the smell of smoke had been replaced by the smell of wind. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know his name. I didn't know where he came from. But even then I knew he'd stay in my memory, even if he didn't come back. I got home before sunset. The garden outside the windows was still the same, manicured, silent. My husband came back later with papers in his hands and a tired face. He kissed me on the cheek, the way one does out of habit. I looked out the window where his figure was almost erased, but the feeling was still there. I never thought I'd see him again. But as it turns out, there are some things that don't forget you, even if you try to forget them. It was a few days later, on the very street where time always flowed sluggishly like syrup down the slope of a cup. I came out of the ribbon shop and was about to return to the carriage when I saw him. He was standing by the well, leaning with one hand on a wooden pole and talking to the blacksmith. I recognized him at once by his posture, by the curve of his shoulders, by the way he held his head, as if he were hearing music that the others had not yet noticed. This time he saw me. His gaze lingered. Not rude, not defiant, just meaningful. Like he was rereading a page he'd once accidentally skipped over. I averted my eyes, pretending I didn't recognize him. I went to the counter and asked for a bunch of lavender even though I didn't need it. Just so I wouldn't leave. He appeared beside me like a shadow, like a thought I'd just tried to push away. He asked if I could tell him how to get to the bridge by the old mill. His voice was low, a little husky, but with a strange calmness, like a warm evening before a storm. I nodded. Of course I knew. And, I don't know why, I answered out loud, even though he didn't insist. And then, without asking, without suggesting it, I went with him. We walked slowly. He stepped a little to the side, no closer than etiquette allowed, but no farther than I needed to feel his presence. He didn't ask questions, didn't act like the men I knew, didn't boast, didn't flirt. Just walked beside me. And that was enough to make my heart clench at every step. "You have a precise gait," he said after a few minutes. "It's as if you know where you're going, not only on the road but all day long." I smiled a little, and I was surprised at how easy it was, how natural. "It's all years of habit," I replied without looking at him. "I'd say it's an experience, or a mystery," he added. "But maybe it's the same thing." Then he reached out to help me cross the clay pothole. His fingers touched my palm for a second, fleetingly. But that second was everything. All my forgotten thoughts, all my unrealized impulses. It felt as if that hand wasn't holding me, but what I could have been, in another life, with a different name. We stopped at the bridge. He looked off into the distance, then turned to me and smiled for the first time. A real smile. There was no calculation in that smile, just weariness, a pinched kindness, and something elusive, like the smoke of a campfire. "Thank you," he said. "I thought I knew the way, but, as you can see, not all roads can be travelled alone. There are plenty of people in town who will clue you in," I remarked. "But only one person can show it," he replied. He held out his hand, not demanding, not formally, just as a gesture of trust. I put mine into it. He tilted his head. "Silas," he said. "Silas Hale." I answered after a second. Less than a breath, but more than a glance. "Clara," I said. "Clara Whitmore." That's how I first said my name, not as wife, not as Mrs., not as half of my last name, just Clara. And he nodded, as if he already knew it. He just wanted to hear what it sounded like coming out of my mouth. We started seeing each other more often. Not so much that it was conspicuous, never next to each other, never under the arm. He knew how to be inconspicuous. And I knew how to pretend nothing was going on. But inside, everything was burning, like the wine that quietly warms from the inside out while you hold your glass and laugh with someone else. Sometimes he would just appear on the road where I was riding. As if by chance, he would bring me yellow flowers that grew only in places no gentleman had ever reached. I'd leave him apples in a sack at the gate. He knew they were from me, and I knew he'd eat them right away without even washing them. It was all said between us, though the words were never spoken. I carried a key to the house, but more often I started to forget why I needed it, because life wasn't there. It was in the dust beneath my feet, in his footprints on the ground, in the smell of the fire that the wind brought with it when he was around. One evening he gestured for me to follow him. No request, no explanation, just a look. I obeyed without fear. We drove for a long time. The road was narrow, overgrown, almost invisible in places. Then the forest parted and I saw the camp. This wasn't just a temporary shelter, it was a home, woven not of walls and windows, but of people, their laughter, their concern for each other. Women were melting stoves, men were mending saddles, children were running between tents, throwing cones at each other. I felt my old idea of bandits crumble under my feet. This wasn't a haven for outlaws. It was a tribe where everyone lived according to their hearts, free but with an eye to the needs of common life. That night, they had a feast. Not on the occasion of my arrival, but simply because they knew how to enjoy even the stars. They sang around the fire. They drank thick, warm wine. An old man was playing the harmonica. A girl was dancing, her hair fluttering like flames. I sat next to him and no one asked who I was. I was accepted unconditionally, as part of something real. I'd never seen so much joy and fun in simple little things, actions. It was all his brainchild. He was responsible for these people. It was his family. He looked at me not as a secret to be hidden, but as a woman who was here, in her place. Late at night, when the fires had died down and the voices had died down, he took me to my tent. It was simple. No luxuries, no bedspreads or mirrors, just 2 mattresses, warm fabric, and his breath. I don't remember who touched my skin first. I don't remember undressing. It wasn't just a moment of passion. It was a home I'd never had before. In his arms I became not a lover, not a fugitive, not a guest. I became me, someone I hadn't been in years. And that night, for the first time in my marriage, I didn't feel like a stranger in my own body. I returned in the dead of night. The wind carried the scent of herbs, familiar and foreign at the same time. Every mile I travelled took me farther from the camp, but inside everything screamed that this was where I'd left my real skin. This house I was pulling up to didn't feel like home to me anymore. It was just a structure, too flat, too right, too alien. Elias was waiting for me. The light in his office was still on. I entered quietly like a guest afraid to disturb the peace. He looked up, tired, warm, still capable of love. I saw in his gaze not reproach, not suspicion, but the familiar anxiety that comes to men who have lived for years in a world where everything can fall apart in a second. He came over and took my palm, lingering for a moment. I let him. My body still held the other man's warmth, but there was a truth in Elias's gesture that I couldn't deny. He wasn't my enemy. He was still my husband. I listened as he told me the news from the county, that they'd found traces of a camp in the mountains, closer to the border, that it was inhabited by people who had long ago left the path of the law, that now the authorities were getting serious about them. He spoke of the gang, of its leader, a dangerous, intelligent, overconfident man. There was no malice in Elias's voice, just professional coldness, just duty. He didn't know that I had seen this man unarmed, unmasked, laughing by the fire. He didn't know that his descriptions were not rumours but my attraction. I nodded without saying a word. I kept my face. but my heart was beating so hard, it felt like he had to hear it. Later, I went up to the bathroom, listening but not saying another word. The water in the tub was warm, lavender-scented. I watched it swaying as if waiting for me. I stepped into it, slowly, as if wiping away the smell of the fire, the dust, his touch. But nothing left. Everything remained in me, like the mark of fire on my skin. When I came out, he was already in bed. He wasn't asleep. He turned to me, held out his hand. I froze, and then I lay down next to him. It wasn't violence, it wasn't passion. It was a ritual we both knew. His lips touched my neck, his hands on my waist, and everything happened as it should between husband and wife, without words, no emotion. I let him, because he was my husband, because I still loved him, because it was my life, my vow, my role. But that night, I felt my body was here, and my soul was gone. He snuggled up to me afterward as usual. He fell asleep quickly. I stared at the ceiling. I counted the beats of my heart. And I knew I'd changed, not because I betrayed him, but because I'd realized for the first time what it meant to be alive. Fear began to creep up stealthily, not in harsh sounds, not in blows of fate, but in little things. In the new letters on her husband's desk, in the tired glances he cast at the county map, in the documents with other states' coats of arms printed on thin paper. Elias no longer shared with me, but he didn't hide it either. He was busy. Really busy. I've seen him spend nights poring over files. I'd seen letters from other prosecutors. I'd seen a sheriff from Nebraska send details of a mail stagecoach raid, and a marshal from Utah send a telegram with names. Among them I read for the first time a name that had hitherto sounded in my life like a breath, like a whisper, like a mystery. Silas Hale. He was no longer a shadow, was no longer a feeling. He had become a target. And I realized our double life was beginning to crumble, not under pressure but from within. I could no longer go out with him the way I used to, with a light heart, a smile in the shadows. I was going to him with a weight on my shoulders, a weight that could crush not only the two of us, but everyone around us. I found him at the camp, by the fire. He was sitting on an old crate picking through shell casings, his rifle, which he'd repaired last week, lying beside him. It was here, in this point of light amidst the darkness, that he had once taken my hand for the first time and showed me how to hold a gun. Said a woman shouldn't be helpless. I laughed then. Now I can hardly breathe. The fire reflected in his face, shadows dancing across his cheekbones. He looked up at me and I saw the same thing, calm, steel, and a drop of tenderness he'd never shown anyone but me. I stepped closer and, without waiting, said everything. Not in an off-handed, feminine way, but straightforwardly, sharply, with the kind of sincerity that comes only when you're scared. I got it out in the open, that Elias was gathering information, that he already had names, that his target is not just a gang but a specific person, that their hunt was not rumors, not fears, but the beginning of a real war. I spoke quickly, almost without pause, as if I wanted to get ahead of the trouble that was already at the gate. He didn't say a word, just stared. His fingers paused on the cold metal, and he set the rifle aside, as if he were cutting off all that was unnecessary with that gesture. There was no alarm in his face, no fear, no doubt, only understanding. And then a step toward me, slowly, without threat, without pressure. He didn't hug me. He just stood next to me. Like he was saying, I'm here. I'm not running away. He knew I was afraid, that this path leads to the abyss. He knew everything, and he stayed anyway. I could feel his breath, hear the log crackling, hear someone laughing in the distance. Life went on around me, and inside me everything trembled. I was a woman torn between two worlds, one where there was faith, duty, order, and the other where there was feeling, freedom, dust, and flame. He said he could take me away, that he could take me away, right now, anywhere, as long as I wanted him to, and that was the scariest thing of all. My feet wanted to step forward. My heart was already there. But the rest of the world was holding me by the shoulders and whispering, "Think." Later that evening, I heard the case being discussed around the campfire. The men spoke calmly with the familiar confidence of those who had repeatedly taken what they thought was right. The plan was simple: one train, several cars, valuables, jewelry, gold bars, all to be done without blood, just fear and speed. Just one step and you could disappear from the horizon, lie low, become invisible again. For them, it was business as usual, ordinary, repetitive, the craft of freedom. For me, it was a point of no return. I looked at him, the one I loved, and I thought, he could be gone. He could disappear. But if something goes wrong, I'll never see him again. Every day I remembered less and less what a life where you don't have to hide your eyes looks like. We began to see each other less often, not out of mutual desire, not out of fatigue, out of necessity. Fear became my companion. I sensed Elias was beginning to guess, not with words, not by actions, but by the long looks that lingered on my eyes. Those delays in his tone when he asked where I'd been. He didn't say anything, but I knew he knew something. I avoided going into town. I avoided the stairs. I didn't even leave apples anymore. Everything that had seemed carefree was now a scream in the midst of silence. I still loved him, both of them. But what had been a secret was now a trap. Silas sensed the change, too. He wasn't angry. He didn't demand. He just accepted, like a man who knows the value of time. Sometimes we'd see each other at dawn, quickly, discreetly. Sometimes just touching hands, as if to make sure we didn't forget we were still here. He understood that each new day could be our last if we didn't retreat. But he never talked about retreating. I knew he and his men were preparing something, but I could feel that something bad was coming. There was tension in the air like before a storm. The silence was not calm but deafening, like before a gunshot. And then, late one night, when I was at home, Elias came into the office. He didn't realize that his every move was like a clock ticking over a scaffold. I watched him take the map, spread it out. The sheets of paper, the telegrams, the notes. He spoke aloud names that used to sound to me like whispers from another world. Now they sound like a sentence. Train, gold, ambush. I understood everything. They knew. They were waiting. He and the others, the prosecutors, the sheriffs, the marshals, all together. They had anticipated their move, realized that this flight, with its cargo of valuables and guards, would be the perfect target. And they were right. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't run away now, it was past midnight, I couldn't warn, I couldn't intervene. I just stood at the window listening to the papers rattling behind me. And prayed. For the first time in years, for real. Not about justice, not salvation. It's about keeping him alive. I prayed that this train would pass through the troubles, that those I love would not be each other's last stop. I prayed that the night would end not with a gunshot, but with a dawn. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling, counting the beats of the clock. They were muffled, heavy. like footsteps to someone's death. The morning when everything fell apart was surprisingly clear. I'd barely gotten up, not yet combed my hair, when they drove into the yard. The clatter of hooves jerked my consciousness awake abruptly. Men's voices. A knock on the door. Elias stepped out, tightening his holster, his face tense, focused. He didn't turn around. Only said briefly that he needed to go. Quickly. No details. I stayed on the veranda. I watched him get into the carriage. I watched him look back at the last moment fleetingly without saying goodbye. And then he was gone. And I realized I'd waited for the morning for nothing. It had already started. And it was too late. I hadn't had time to warn him, to stop. I lived the rest of the day as if in a delirium. Shadows slid across the floor, the sun changed colour, and I didn't move. I just sat in the chair, feeling something in my chest spreading like a thin crack in glass. I tried not to think, but thoughts knocked at my head. Where is he? Is he alive? Will he make it? Which one of them will be the first to raise his weapon? I didn't know whether to pray, who to pray for, to go there, but where to. I didn't know where it would happen. Just wait? That's all I could do. In the evening, when it seemed that silence had become my enemy, there was another knock at the door. 2 silhouettes, one in uniform, the other discreet in a long coat. They didn't ask permission to enter. Their faces were hard but tired, like those who are tired of bearing bad news. They said Elias was badly wounded. He was rushed to the hospital. I was frightened to ask for details, and they said that a bullet fired by one of the bandits had hit him in the stomach. Elias fell wounded from his horse but managed to answer with a revolver in the back of his assailant. Then the lawmen covered him and took him to the hospital. He is dying. His last wish is to see me. Now. There's not much time left. I froze. I didn't scream, didn't fall. I just nodded and walked upstairs. Each step was hard. It was like my legs were filled with lead. I dressed in silence. My fingers wouldn't listen. My ears were buzzing. When I came downstairs, they were still waiting at the front door without entering the house. At the door, quietly, respectful. I walked toward them like I was going to the scaffold, and that's when the back door creaks open. He came in quickly, quietly and accurately. I recognized him immediately. One of Silas's men. Someone who was always there for me but never spoke too much. His face was white as a sheet. His lips were dry. His voice was barely audible. He beckoned me to him so we wouldn't be seen. He told everything now from the other side of the battle. They were ambushed. The lawmen were waiting for them. Outnumbered. There was a firefight, a chase, a few dead campers. 2 of them were arrested. The rest escaped whoever they could. Silas was covering their escape and was shot in the back in the firefight. Badly. He was carried to cover and finally managed to escape. But it's a mess. Silas is still alive, but not for long. And before he dies, he repeats the name Clara, wanting to see me one last time. My friend said the horse is waiting to take me to the camp, but we have to hurry. I was standing between 2 doors. At the front door, the lawmen. At the black one, a friend of the man I was most afraid of losing. One path led to my husband, the man with whom I shared a life, a home, a name, years. The other was to the man I fell in love with as a girl, abruptly, without remnant, no going back. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, a ringing in my ears. Time shrank, space disappeared. All that was left was me, and a choice. One step, and it becomes destiny. I took the coat, clutched it in my hands like a life preserver, inhaled, once, deeply, exhaled, and took a step toward the door. It's up to you to decide where. Dear listeners, this is not a trite love story, and it's not just a story about cheating. It's a story about life, about the pain of making choices, about how sometimes you wish you didn't have to make a choice. Let me know in the comments where you think Clara went. To the husband she'd lived with for 15 years? Or to the man who revitalized her soul? What would you do? Leave your ending to this story in the comments. It's yours now.